So what does the department store, the bicycle, anxieties about gender, race, and class have to do with imperialism or race? Well, this is a time where, in fact, through the violent enterprise of imperialism, people define themselves in relation to others that they deem different. On the one hand, ideas about citizenship and of the nation, remember this is the age of nationalism, were based upon beliefs in common blood, common language, common past, and common ethnicity. Italy believed it had a common past in the Roman Empire, Germany in Charlemagne's Empire. And in fact, so much so that the French historian Ernest Renan wrote in 1886, and I quote, "The essence of a nation is that all individuals have many things in common, and also that they have forgotten many things." And he added, "A nation is a soul, a spiritual principle. Like the individual, it is the culmination and of a long past of endeavors, sacrifice, and devotion." And I think this definition only makes sense if we put it in the context of empire, that a nation is only great if it possesses an empire. That in fact, what all individuals need to forget in order to believe they are a nation is that nations were forged through violence, the violence of dispossession and conquest of others, and that the endeavors, sacrifice, and devotion are the three very principles that will be evoked to support the imperialist enterprise. Now, Britain declares itself an empire in 1876. And in France, the great economic historian Anatole Leroy-Beaulieu argued that, and I quote, "Colonization is for France a question of life and death. Either France will become a great African power, or in a century or two, she will be no more than a secondary European power." And here we see how almost all of the nations, the European nations, believed that an empire was essential for the glory and strength of their own nation. This was also the case, the conviction of conservatives such as British Minister Disraeli or French Republican Minister Jules Ferry. In the early 1880s, Ferry argued that Parliament that France needed new markets. He said that if Frenchmen did not colonize Africa, France would drop from the first rank to the third or the fourth. And indeed, the economy is a political argument in support of imperialism. By the mid-1880s, even Bismarck, who was more skeptical and cautious and more concerned with domestic politics, changed his mind and argued to the Reichstag that the German economy needed colonies and that imperialism would provide, in his words, a new field for German activity, civilization, and capital. So your textbook describes the characteristics of new imperialism, but let me offer you a small reminder. In fact, 11% of the African continent was under European rule in 1875. By 1902, barely less than 30 years, 30 years later, 90% of the African continent was under European domination. And in fact, approximately 70% of the land surface of the planet was under the control of the Europe and US by 1914. Britain alone ruled over a fourth of the land and a third of the world population. So imperialism was always more than an economic enterprise. Imperialism also fundamentally changed the ways Europeans thought of themselves and of their nations as modern. It was connected to all the major developments of the 19th century: industrialization, liberal politics and economics, democratic revolutions, technological advance, mass nationalism. And it was sustained by two underlying intellectual and cultural projects, which united diverse and sometimes contradictory explanations, justifications, and practices. First, the attempt to construct and explain imagined differences between people. And second, the attempt to define and justify the hierarchy of those different people. So what did imperialism entail as policy and as practice? It entailed the use of military strength and industrial technology to impose control, very often violently, over the territory, resources, and populations of Africa and Asia. It was characterized by extreme inequality between the power of the European metropole and the non-European colonies. It also marked the subordination of indigenous people to European economic and political administrations who ruled their lives. And it was sustained by an imperial culture that was racist and orientalist. And one of the foundational pieces of this was the emerging scientific racism. So why do we call it scientific racism? Because it was racist ideology that argued that it was scientific in nature, objective, and was merely reflecting the world as it was, when in fact it was a purely racist construction. And social Darwinism was central to this particular ideological construction. Social Darwinism was the theory that human groups and races are subjects to the same laws of natural selection that Charles Darwin had perceived in plants and animals. Now, according to this theory, which became incredibly popular in the late 19th and early 20th century, the weak were diminished and their cultures limited, while the strong grew in power and in cultural influence over the weak. And it is not a surprise that those who were colonized were identified as weak and Europeans identified as strong. Social Darwinists held that the life of humans in society was a struggle for existence, and in fact, was ruled by survival of the fittest, a phrase proposed by the British scientist Herbert Spencer. And this justified what became known as the civilizing mission, that is the duty to civilize barbarian. And here is an example of the kind of racist thinking that masqueraded as science. For instance, if we look at what the French writer Arthur de Gobineau wrote on the inequality of the human races, he began from the very principle that races existed and were fundamentally unequal, and wrote, "The civilization motif was renewed when evolutionary science applied to racial differences among humans, classified Africans as a developmentally inferior race." And others, such as Ernst Haeckel, borrowed from these ideas to map out populations. And notice these rather difficult to look at because profoundly racist images that map out a world in which Africans are considered to be inferiors in a hierarchical that leads, if you look at the one on the left, that leads all the way to European. And notice that the European here is represented in the manner of a Greek classical statue, an ideal that was of course a myth, and that in fact was an argument in the support of the belief that Europe was one of the greatest civilizations. So imperialism fundamentally defined European life, experience, and identity. So to illustrate this, let me give you an example. Again, some of these images will be rather difficult to look at because they either dehumanize or devalue those that are represented. But this photo was taken in 1899. In the summer of 1819, in the summer, a group of prominent Dutch women held an industrial fair at The Hague in 1899. And The Hague was then the capital of the thriving imperial nation of the Netherlands. What was their goal? Their goal was to showcase the nation's achievements, and in particular to display women workers in modern industry, the arts and crafts. And the fair also featured Dutch life beyond Europe, making the exposition an act of national pride, or a national cause, as sponsors called it. And outside of the main buildings, the fair offered viewers a model Indonesian village complete with local people imported like goods forcibly from the prosperous Dutch colony to display folkways and indigenous life. They played Indonesian music, the gamelan, cooked Indonesian food, and dyed the celebrated batik fabric under the eyes of Dutch and other visitors. And these became known as human zoos and were incredibly and troublingly popular throughout all of Europe. And why were these so popular? Because this display of human beings reduced to goods for the pleasure of a European public brought the colonies home to the metropole. In fact, it is crucial to remember that much of the splendor of European life in the late 19th century and early 20th century depended upon the importation of resources, including designs, techniques, ideas, art, music, and natural materials from around the world. And let me give you some examples. Now, here are two paintings that illustrate the ways in which European life depended upon imperialism and the forcible subjection of others and plunder of colonial resources. So on the right, you have still a classic Orientalist painting. Again, remember that as France had forcibly colonized North Africa in Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, what it did is that it celebrated its belief that here it had a right to this particular land. On the left, this painting of a British middle-class interior is a reminder of all of the ways in which the splendor of bourgeois life depended upon the colonies. If you look at the carpet, which would have been brought back or inspired from Persian rugs or South Asian rugs, the fabrics that depended upon the cottons and the silks, as well as the design of the fabric, the shawl that would have been made in these expensive fabrics, the wood, the exotic woods plundered from African forests, as well as the gold and the ivory of the notes, the piano notes, and the gold of the clock on the piano. All of this had been attained through plunder and violence. And we see this in all kinds of different ways. We see how, in fact, reaching and conquering Asia in turn inspired the early 20th century fascination with Asian culture, with the opera Madame Butterfly by Puccini in 1904, or the fashion to the left, directly borrowed and appropriated from Japanese and Chinese culture. And here, in a rather very literal, explicit description of the empire, what we have is, again, the display of how the racist beliefs that Africans were inferior, that is contrasted and used to justify imperialism. On the right, a clear racist representation in support of pear soap, with on the left the woman that emerges, clearly a middle-class white British woman, here evoking the Venus of Botticelli emerging from her shell. And the left advert is even more striking, because pear soap is, in fact, the advert argues, the first step towards lightening the white man's burden, the expression coined by Rudyard Kipling. Why? Because it teaches the virtues of cleanliness. Pear soap, and I am reading the ad, is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances, while amongst the cultured of all nations, it holds the highest place. It is the ideal. Totally so. But these rich goods, these interiors, these practices, and these consumer goods should not let us forget the violence of imperialism. Most notably, that was practiced through the age of new or high imperialism. One of the facts little known is that the very practice of a concentration camp made famous by the Nazi regime in the 20th century, that is a detention camp, was in fact an invention and owes its origin to imperialism, more specifically to the Boer War of 1899. So what happened in this war? In 1899, Britain became engaged in a shockingly bloody, even desperate fight for the control of South African wealth, diamond, gold, and mines for all of these, against the descendants of Dutch settlers called the Boers. So the Boers, who controlled the Transvaal and the Dutch Free State, ruled over a number of African groups, including the Zulus, and they contested the arrival of adventurers from Britain like Cecil Rhodes, who had tried to stir up war in hopes that the British could lay claim over Dutch lands. Now, in this war, both sides used African troops, and the British even brought over Indian colonial troops. Even though they outnumbered the Boers by 7-1, they struggled to win the war, and the war dragged on. And the war was also uncharacteristically publicized back home in Europe. Foreign correspondents who flocked to South Africa reported appalling bloodsheds, heavy casualties, and unfit conditions for British soldiers. Even more troubling for the British public were the new ways in which South Africans were treated. They were being herded, and this is what the reporters were writing. South Africans were being herded in concentration camps where diseases were rampant and treatment inhumane. And these concentration camps became graveyards for tens of thousands of them. Even Kipling, who supported imperialism, criticized the British in this war. In fact, imperialism brought increasing, shockingly rising levels of violence against the indigenous peoples of Africa. Any uprising was brought down brutally, and actual colonial rule was especially brutal and violent, the most infamous instance being the Belgian Congo, which was colonized in 1908 until 1960, and that used terror, violence, and murder to rule. Now, if we remember the definition of imperialism from Edward Said, violence was always a given of imperialism. It was not a reaction. And for this, I want to conclude with an especially shocking and heartbreaking historical event that illustrates the violence of imperialism. And that takes place again on the African continent. Between 1904 and 1906, the Germans, who were then trying to build their own empire, pursued a policy of devastation against the Herero people, who were resisting the inroads on their cattle trade and grazing lands in Southwest Africa. And German soldiers wielded machine guns, mowing down the Hereros, men, women, and children, a tactic that one German general defended as an appropriate display of, and I quote, iron firmness. There is little archival remnants of this devastation, but here is one lone photograph that troublingly shows what happened to the Herero people. The Herero population was reduced from 100,000 to 8,000 people, and the survivors were driven away from their territory. And this inaugurated the tactic of leaving people without basic means of support or shelter that was used especially against African peoples, and later against Russian peasants, Jews, and other religious and ethnic groups in Europe in the 20th century. And in fact, colonial powers' use of mass slaughter has led some historians to see imperialism as a training ground for future wars. So what we need to keep in mind is that what was modern and that had been a source of pride and faith and progress was also from the beginning riven with tensions, that the technology that brought electricity also allowed massacres to take place, that the expansion of industry that led to flourishing department stores also allowed indiscriminate violence against entire nations and populations. Now, if Marx and Engels had argued imperialism was central to the development of capitalism, now others, a minority still, berated and denounced it. And by the late 19th century, modernity was no longer a self-confident assertion, even as Europeans wrestled with the influence of imperialism.